Hello, Frizzle Freaks. It is time today to give you a recommendation from my most read and debatably most favorite genre, urban fantasy. So first, let's take a few minutes to explore what is urban fantasy, where did it come from, and why is it awesome? And then we'll get into the book recommendations for every personality type and exploring some different subgenres of urban fantasy through that. So at the basic level, urban fantasy is a subgenre of fantasy. Let's break that down a little bit. The genre of fantasy as we know it today sits on the foundation of the Lord of the Rings. The Lord of the Rings is like this painting in like a neoclassical style where it was looking back at the myths of the day and then thinking, okay, what if we told new awesome stories about elves? And then thousands of writers looked at Lord of the Rings and said, ooh, I could do that too. And then through the decades, we get developing what is now modern high fantasy, which is kind of like this painting, where it's riffing off the previous one, where it's taking inspiration from it, but it's putting different spins on it. It's saying like, okay, but what if those fantasy elves were morally gray? What if those elves were funny? What if those elves had incredibly intricate sciencey magic? And on and on. And then in the 1980s, you see the beginning of urban fantasy, which is now asking the question, okay, but what if those elves were in rock bands? What if those elves lived in the cities that we live in, which is where the name urban fantasy comes from. You look back to like Lord of the Rings style fantasy, it's very pastoral. People are living out in the countryside on the farms and journeying through the woods. Urban fantasy is taking place in New York, in London, in the modern day cities. Urban fantasy is taking that old pastoral fantasy and mixing it with the modern genres of like paranormal horror, of like, okay, what if you had elves and vampires and you smashed them together? What's gonna happen then? So urban fantasy as a subgenre belongs in the category of low fantasy, where it's not typically creating its own magical world, though we'll get into urban fantasies that do that anyway. Urban fantasies are like, what if you had our normal world plus some magic? And when I try to explain urban fantasy to people, like every time, this is where someone says, oh, like Harry Potter? And like, okay, yes and no. Because though Harry Potter, you could say, fits the description of normal world plus magic, it isn't functionally an urban fantasy. It doesn't follow any of the tropes of urban fantasy. Because though technically it's all taking place inside of the Muggle world, it's actually taking place inside the wizarding world. You know? The fact that normal Earth Muggle world is right outside of the door isn't really ever relevant in the Harry Potter series. And so something like Harry Potter belongs more in the genre of portal fantasy, where a character starts in the normal Muggle world and then goes through a sort of portal into the wizarding world. In urban fantasy, we're not trying to run away from the Muggle world, we're trying to transform it and ruminate in it and have fun with it. Urban fantasy isn't asking the question of what if we could escape through a portal to the elven world, it's asking the question of what if those elves were here in our rock bands? Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. Now let's get into the book recommendations. And as we go through the book recommendations, I'm going to be discussing some common subgenres of urban fantasy so you can get a sense for those as well. The recommendations will be sorted by Booktone. This is a reader personality type system that I designed. If you would like to take the test, and I highly recommend you do, I'll have that linked in the footnotes for you. It only takes 2 minutes. Now, there are 14 personality types, and here are how those are organized. The pale colors are the intellectual focused types. These are the readers who like to think, who like to be intellectually challenged while reading their books. The saturated darker colors are the emotional types. These are for readers that really like to feel things while they're reading. And of course, in real readers, there's a large spectrum of readers and large mixes, but we are simplifying it to 2 camps. Pick your side. The red types are plot focused. These are ones that are really gunning for the action, for the high stakes. stakes, for the things on the line. The blue types are character focused. These are for the readers who really love character arcs and relationships being explored. The yellow types are for the atmosphere, for the vibes, for the world building, for the way that the book is constructed, for the writing style and magic systems. And then all of the colors are mixes of those primary colors and types. You are most likely to love the book that matches your type. But of course, this isn't a perfect science. Real people are on a spectrum of taste. And so keep an eye out for the recommendation that matches your type, but also keep an eye out for all the recommendations that are neighboring your type, where those recommendations are also for you. And honestly, like, all the recommendations I have today are fantastic, so I kind of recommend all of them. So let's kick it off, starting with which is intellectual and plot focused. My recommendation for this type is Rivers of London. This book showcases really well a common trope of urban fantasy, which goes like this. We have a typical police officer in modern day London, and one day he gets recruited to join the secret magic police, and then he gets catapulted into being a detective solving these crimes where the perpetrators are using magic, and he has to learn both about the people in this magical secret part of society and how to use magic himself. So urban fantasies often have this hidden magical society in the world, where you have your normal people who don't know anything about magic, and then you have your secret magical society that's dealing with it every day, and they are coexisting. Another common trope of urban fantasy is following a detective solving mysteries. That'll come up again and again, and I'll talk more about it later. And now, Xanthous Orange. This is intellectual, plot, and atmosphere focused. And the recommendation is Legendborn. This is following again in the trope of a hidden magic society, where we are following a girl who goes off to college, and when she gets there, she discovers a secret society following the traditions of the Knights of the Round Table and fighting off modern day demons with the magic. This book also showcases a real strength of urban fantasy, which is like in epic fantasy, you could explore themes of racism. You know, you can have the yellow elves hate the blue elves or whatever. But in urban fantasy, you can say, okay, today we are exploring racism at this college in North Carolina in this time period. It can get much more specific as you're actually setting the book in our world. The next book tone, Chiffon Yellow. This is intellectual, atmosphere focused, and for this category, it's really focused in on the world building. And the recommendation is An Inheritance of Magic. So one of the criticisms I often see of urban fantasy is like, oh, their magic systems are so lazy. Because over here in epic fantasy, you have like Brandon Sanderson making whole like science systems out of the magic systems. And then there are some urban fantasies out here that are just like, there's vampires and werewolves, and I guess we'll throw in angels too. And it's much more of a messy smorgasbord of soft magic system. But that's not always the case, and this is a book that has a really nice, intriguing, hard magic system. This book is also somewhat of a progression fantasy where a lot of the book's plot is hinging on this character slowly leveling up in the magic system. This book also gets bonus points in the atmosphere department for having really well-developed themes where the character is really exploring like, what is my purpose in life, and wrestling with that philosophy. And through that we also get a pretty good character focus, but would definitely recommend this one for the people who are loving intellectual atmosphere focus. Next up, we're kicking it to Celadon Green. This is intellectual, atmosphere, and character focused. And the recommendation goes to All the Crooked Saints. And this urban fantasy really has the subgenre of magical realism, where, yes, like the ones we've just talked about, some urban fantasies have like a really strong, hard magic system. Some urban fantasies have a really structured, secret magical society. And some urban fantasies are much more on the magical realism track. Magic just kind of exists without explanation. The magic system is very soft, very weird, and that can sometimes be all of the fun. Like in this book, it takes place in a small town in deserty Colorado. And there's a family there who have the magical ability to create little miracles in people's lives, but they often come with a terrible price. And it's exploring the family dynamics through all of that. An absolutely gorgeous book. For Uranium Blue, I'm giving you the recommendation that is most recently published on all of this list and a recent favorite of mine, When Among Crows. This book showcases a common trend in urban fantasy, which is really reimagining myths and folklore, where this book is steeped in Polish folklore and all of the monsters and magic from that, but placing it in modern-day Chicago, where yes, that monster from that old myth does exist. She owns a movie theater downtown. And When Among Crows also really nails the urban part of urban fantasy, where in this book, our gaggle of characters is traveling around the city and seeing different sights, and you really get the busyness of that city feeling. Highly recommend When Among Crows. I loved it. And it's a novella, making it the shortest of the recommendations of today. Our next type is Thistle Purple. This is intellectual, character, and plot focused. And the recommendation for this one is Stormfront, book 1 in the Dresden Files. And there's a very specific point I want to make with this recommendation. Because Dresden Files is a very long, ongoing series. We have 17 books published so far, and if you count the short story collections and the novellas and everything, even more than that. And this tends to be true, especially for a lot of the really popular urban fantasy series, is they tend to get quite long. And a lot of the reason for this is because a lot of books in urban fantasy tend to be quite episodic, where you have this book, and this book we are dealing with a ghost threat, and this book we are dealing with a werewolf threat, and this book we are dealing with the Fae. Very nicely partitioned like that, where every book will have a single plot. And the plots from book to book will interconnect, sometimes in the best kind of ways, but every book will be very stand on its own. This could potentially be an entry point to the series. And this is something that I love about urban fantasy, because the fact that the books tend to be very partitioned and their own thing means that in every book you get a satisfying conclusion. Now, this doesn't mean that there aren't going to be cliffhangers, because of course there are, it's a book series. But it does mean that you often get a very satisfying ending in each installment, something which you don't always get with epic fantasy, where everything much more mushes together into one long story. Another point I want to make with the Dresden Files series is that it's still like the biggest name in urban fantasy genre right now. The first book was published in the year 2000, and it's still the reigning champ of this genre. What gives? And a lot of it is the trends of publishing. It seems like the heyday of true urban fantasy was like 20 years ago. And that's where everything peaked and everything started coming out. And now things are slowing down to a trickle a lot, where you don't see as many big urban fantasy series being published nowadays. Now, of course, there are some. I'm giving you lots of recommendations right now, aren't I? But this is a trend that I would definitely love to see rise again. I'm always looking for new awesome urban fantasy, but honestly, the old stuff from like 2 decades ago, that is where I found a lot of my favorites. So I never said what Dresden Files is about. It's about a wizard in modern day Chicago, and he's the one who gets called in when the cops have a murder that they think might have been committed by like a wizard or a vampire or something. And there's lots of high stake mystery adventures there. And because Dresden Files is such a big name, I think I'm going to give a second recommendation for the Thistle Purple type, which is Warped Minds and Other Misdemeanors. Similar to Dresden Files, this is following a magic detective guy. He has a past as a con man, but he's trying to turn over a new leaf, somewhat forcedly, or else he's gonna go to life in prison if he doesn't. And one of the reasons why I want to highlight Warped Minds is because this is a self-published book. I was just talking about how the trends in traditionally published fantasy haven't been booming with urban fantasy for like the last 10 years. And so a lot of the urban fantasy has moved into the indie published space, and you can find so many bangers there. We're going to be talking about more in a few minutes. Then a recommendation for Gainsboro Gray. This is intellectual and a mix of all of the types of character, plot, and atmosphere. And the hexologist is something that we haven't seen yet in any of the recommendations I've given you, which is it has its own unique fantasy world. It doesn't take place in our normal world. And I know, you're saying, but Chloe, didn't you say that the definition of urban fantasy was like the normal world plus magic? Well, here's where things get tricky. Because yes, the hexologist has its own fantasy world. By definition, that makes it high fantasy, ineligible for the categorization of urban fantasy, but not really. Because urban fantasy is more of a collection of common tropes than strict definitions. And though maybe the hexologist doesn't fit into the strictest of definitions, it does follow the collection of urban fantasy tropes. And so it counts as an urban fantasy. One of those main tropes that it's following is the urbanness of it all. Is yes, this takes place in a fantasy world, but it's like a steampunk fantasy world where the characters are distinctly in a city. And this book is dealing with the mixture of magic and technology, one of the core themes and tropes of urban fantasy. It's also following a detective duo as they solve magical crimes. So yeah, it counts. Also, this detective duo is a happily married couple and like, oh, chef's kiss, so good. So highly recommend, especially for lovers of steampunk vibes. This has got it in spades. Next up, we are breaking into Vermillion Red, our first emotional category. This is emotionally and plot focused. Here we have another recommendation, which some people might argue is not quite urban fantasy, but counts in my book, which is Renegades. This falls squarely into the genre of superhero, where we are following battles and drama between the heroes and the villains, and how they're all morally gray in the end. We have a teen boy who's been raised among the heroes, and he's starting to go a little bit vigilante, skirting outside the lines, and we have a teenage girl raised by the villains, and her goal is to kill all of the heroes, and they collide and have a romance and laws of action. It's so good. Now, not only this novel, but also arguably all of superhero media also fits into a lot of the tropes and genre of urban fantasy. Of course, it depends. There's a wide range of superhero stuff. A lot of them squarely are about cities. Like you have Spider-Man web-slinging around New York. And while Renegades takes place in a fictional city, not in our real world, it's also following all of those superhero tropes that come through and around urban fantasy. Then for International Orange, which is emotional and plot atmosphere focused, we have Sandman Slim. This is definitely the darkest of the recommendations with subgenres of horror mixed in there, and this is a through line through a lot of urban fantasy, where the urban fantasy genre got a lot of its roots through mixing like the Tolkien high fantasy stuff and the weird monster horror stuff and then smashing it together. So there's a lot of urban fantasy books out there that are really keeping that horror bent, and you could argue that a lot of horror books out there have a subgenre of urban fantasy. It just kind of depends on where the emphasis is. So Sandman Slim is following a guy who got unfairly imprisoned in hell for a decade. He's been an assassin, a gladiator, he's gotten rough around the edges down there. And then he gets to come back to the regular world, and he is on a mission to kill the people who sent him to hell in the first place. And then along the way, he's having a lot of trouble readjusting to regular life, and also, there's like this apocalypse that starts happening, and like, dang it, maybe he's gotta go save the world instead of getting his revenge. Then we make it to Unmellow Yellow, emotional atmosphere focus. This book is all about the vibes, the feelings it gets, playing with mythology of it all, and this is American Gods. This book, as the title suggests, is following the gods of America. And no, not the gods that you would find in our regular religions, but the gods of the folklore of yesteryears who have immigrated to America, and kind of exploring the idea of America of a melting pot of religious and mythological folklore, and so becomes also a melting pot of the gods of those folklore. And we are following a regular, somewhat boring dude who gets entangled with all of these gods and goes across the country on various road trips and adventures, interacting with them. Next up, we've got Jade Green, emotional, atmosphere, character focused. And here we've got Even Though I Knew the End. This book is historical urban fantasy, because yes, it's regular world plus magic, but that regular world doesn't have to be modern regular world. This book takes place in 1920s. So yes, you do have the speakeasies of it all. And this book is really relishing in a detective noir tone, where we are following a woman who is on the trail of a magical serial killer, and the entire tone of the book is saturated in the noir feeling. That's because another origin of the genre of urban fantasy is taking cues from the noir detective novels of the early 1900s, where it's kind of asking the question of like, okay, but what if those snappy, hard-boiled detectives were solving cases about elves and angels and stuff? And that's where you get amazing tales like this. And this is another novella if you're looking for a short recommendation. Then we have Resolution Blue. This is emotional, character focused, and the recommendation is The Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches, because yes, urban fantasy can be horror leaning, but it can also be cozy which is this. This book is following a witch, and she is ever so lonely until she takes a job, which is tutoring 3 little witch orphans, as she also bonds with their various guardians and caretakers and starts up a little romance. It's a very cute book about the power of found family and finding your own and claiming your spot in the world and fighting off loneliness with it. Then Byzantium Purple. This is emotional, character, plot focused. And here we have what might be categorized as a paranormal romance burn for me. So the genre of urban fantasy and the genre of paranormal romance are like Venn diagrams that are almost completely intersecting, where for a lot of books categorized as paranormal romance, they're just urban fantasy with a good side plot of romance in them. Some paranormal romances are like true full romances or eroticas and then just have like a setting that aligns with urban fantasy, but I feel like all those paranormal romances also deserve the title of urban fantasy, particularly this one, which has very strong, you guessed it, detective vibes, where we are following a desperate woman on a case who also encounters a really hot man along the way who is also detectiving on that case, and they have to work together and sparks fly as they're doing it. Now, I find the intersection of urban fantasy and paranormal romance so interesting because it makes the whole bundle of urban fantasy so much more female-led than other fantasy tends to be. Because a lot of female authors have made their space, maybe being marketed first as paranormal romance, even if their plots were mainly fantasy plots with the side plot of romance. So yay, there is a lot of urban fantasy out there that is very female-focused, female-led, has awesome romances in it, and yay. But this has also caused a little bit of a, I would say, schism in urban fantasy, obviously not with all the books, but we have these very female-driven, female-led books, and then almost, it feels like in reaction, the very male-driven, masculine-feeling books, which often end up being very sexist. So you'll find that in the books. I think the genre as a whole has definitely been growing a lot in the last few decades and has been moving away from that, but as you pick up books, even the ones on this recommendation, you might find some pretty annoying male characters, but don't worry, like all of them get character arcs over the course of a few books and get better-ish. Then, and I've saved one of my best recommendations for last, 𝐂𝐸𝐬𝐻 Gray, which is emotional, atmosphere, character, plot focused. And the recommendation goes to Minimum Wage Magic. This is another self-published book, very high quality. I love this series. And one of the reasons why I love this series is it's really playing with its setting, where we are in the urban city. The city is so much a part of this book. The city has magic. The city also has like cyberpunk elements, and we are mixing it all in between. So like the main character is a mage and she does lots of magic. And then we have side characters that are like AI and cyborg and everything, and it all mixes so well and so fun. And I love this playful, ingenious world building that you can get in urban fantasy like this. So this book follows a woman, and her day job is she cleans out old apartments, often apartments that have interesting magical properties and messes, and then one of those messes gets her in hot water with the magical mob and bigger conspiracies. Super fun. And those are 14 urban fantasy book recommendations. I hope you can like the one that matches your type, neighboring types, and whatever else strikes your fancy, because I recommend them all. Thanks for watching, and you'll probably be interested in next watching more of my Booktone themed videos like this one.